Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'm Amy Irvine. I'm from Oceans North. I'm the Oceans and Climate Advisor. Oceans North is a nonprofit based out of Canada, and while a lot of our work is in the Arctic, we do have a focus also on fisheries in Canada. So today I'll be talking about assessing climate risk and building resiliency in Northwest Atlantic fish stocks. In particularly, I'll be talking about a climate risk project that is in collaboration with many organizations, some of them being a consultancy in Halifax, Wild Ocean Research, Visuality, a platform developer based in Spain, Aquamaps 2.0 based out of University of Miami, so they do global models, and then also Dalhousie University based out of Nova Scotia as well. We all know climate change has many impacts on the ocean. Specifically in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Arctic, we're seeing a lot of ocean warming, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation. And as a result of these environmental shifts, you also have changes in the ecosystem structure. Whether this is through invasive species, northward range shifts of species, or even earlier sea ice melt, which all have cascading effects through the ecosystems. One of the main examples of species range shifts and why we're all here is the American lobster, or why many of us are here. And so what you can see here is the historical distribution shown in red. This is from about the 1980s, and it's range shifting northward or expanding northwards. And this is now having impacts for fisheries, as we are now talking about, and as well, again, ecosystem structures and climate change risk towards these species. And so one of my colleagues were looking into how climate change is actually being incorporated into fisheries management in Canada, and they found that it's actually quite minimal. So they did publish a report on this in 2021, and they wanted to do another report to look at the actual stock assessments. And what they found in this paper is that only about 11% of stock assessments mentioned climate change in any way. So while there is still progress with climate change, there's a lot more work that has to be done going forward. And so Oceans North, in our take of fisheries management, we then contracted some of these authors to do a more deep dive into the Northwest Atlantic fisheries. So we produced a report in 2021 looking at these climate risk impacts for Northwest fisheries, and then further created another report that just was more for policymakers. That's a very high level summary of these outcomes from the contracted report. And then in 2024, we produced a final report looking at a climate risk index, which is what I'll be talking about more. And this was looking across all the fish stocks and seeing which ones have the highest and lowest risk scores. Which brings us to the Climate Risk Index for Biodiversity, or CRIB. So this report was produced for Nature Climate Change, and it looked at global models of species, and it's basically a scorecard, a report card, seeing how climate change is going to impact them, and you can compare and rank species based on these climate change impacts. So jumping further into how this works, on a global scale, species are modeled. So I mentioned Aquamaps. They do the models for as many species as they can globally. You can look at the species geographic distribution, and then further the CRIB looked at 3 different indices that were then supported by a lot of variables. So sensitivity is the climate risk for present day, so how that species is responding now. Exposure, how those species are gonna look into, how they will be performing in the future for all these changes in the environment. And adaptivity, so the innate ability of that species to respond to climate change. Using these 3 indices, they were also mapped globally. And you can kind of see how the scores range from 0 to 1, and you can see current, future, and innate ability of these species for climate change. Climate vulnerability then came from an average of these 3 indices mapped on a global scale from 0 to 1. To help this with policy making, it's then converted to climate risk. So this is where it's categorized, so negligible, minimal, high, or critical risk, to help them make decisions. So this is where we're looking at climate risks for species. You can also take this to an ecosystem or wider species approach. So if you overlay the models of species for all their climate risk assessments, you get an idea of where the highest climate risk scores are on a global scale. We then want to focus this to Atlantic Canada. And this is where we operationalized it in a global warming hotspot, as we all know. And when we focused on the Atlantic ecoregion, they looked at fish stocks, and they found out about 41% of fish stocks were at high climate risk under a high emission scenario. So this is SSP 5, 8.5, if you know those. And so then when it was to a lower emission scenario, this decreased to about 25%. Species in the Northwest Atlantic at high or critical risk were at these risk scores across about 30% of their range. Within this paper, they also looked at the landed value of species in Atlantic Canada, and as we can expect, American lobster had one of the highest percentages compared to the others. And then they mapped the landed value of this across Eastern Canada, so darker blue indicates higher landed value. And then overlaid this also with a climate exposure risk, so you can see where those overlap, which is primarily along the coasts and Nova Scotia, if you know geography of the area, and then climate risk. So this is the categorized variables in the overlap. That's okay. So you can see its highest risk kind of along where the primary landed catch is. Other highlights from this is that harvested species had higher climate sensitivity and exposure. Proportion of species with high or critical climate risk were higher near coastlines, as you kind of saw from those figures before. And that lowering emissions most benefited species in near shore and high latitude environments. As well, in this paper, they looked at it across individual stocks. So zooming in on just the piece here where the American lobster is, I put stars across the American lobster and the different fishing zones within Canada. And what you're looking at is a green dot for the low emission scenario, and purple dot is high emission scenario. And this middle dotted line is the difference between moderate and high risk. So what you're looking at is that if you're on a high emission scenario trajectory, you will be at a higher risk for some of these stock areas. But if you lower emissions, you can see how it benefits specific stock areas, and that can have benefits when you're applying it to fishers or policy. Further, this index was applied in multiple different areas. So in the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, so NAFO, they applied the crib risk score across their stocks as well. And so they produced a report on the crib assessments, for example, Atlantic wolffish, capelin, and a few others as well. And it was evaluated across Canada. And so this map shows a number of the species that are high or critical risk and where the highest numbers of those are. So you can see where yellow is around Hudson's Bay, that's where it has the highest number of species that are at those high risk levels. Further, the crib is already being applied globally and across Canada, of course. So we've been integrating the crib into a climate adaptation framework for fisheries. So this is within Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And we're also on a contract with the New Zealand Fisheries Ministry to apply the crib to their fisheries as well to help them incorporate climate change into their decisions. Regionally, the crib is also being applied to harvested species in Atlantic Canada for small craft fishing harbors and supporting coastal infrastructure vulnerability, and adapting the crib for lobster and snow crab in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they're creating really high resolution models for those specific areas of interest. And I now want to dive in a little bit to how we're trying to take the crib into an actual platform that can be usable for beyond just the academic network and fisheries-focused people. So this fisheries prototype is how we're working with our platform developers to create a very visually appealing model or platform, website, interactive design that people can use and design, like select areas of interest. This is approximately how we've created it so far, but it's still undergoing a lot of refinement with community on the ground and also government. So how it could look is a map here of areas of high and low climate risk, high being orange. And then you have a list of all the species based on their stock area and their climate risk score with the standard deviation. And as well, you can compare that to stock status. So you can consider both climate risk and how the stock is being assessed. And then you'd be able to compare between low and high emissions. So if you can see You can go back and forth. Hypothetically, this would be how you can compare climate risk across time. You can then filter for regions or species or landed biomass. And then you can pull out just a particular area, and then that will show the species that have been assessed for that area. And then you can look at a specific species. So for like stock status, you can look at those various indicators that I mentioned earlier and how each one is defined with the data. I'm going to quickly go through this since I'm running out of time by accident. And so we're also looking at this for marine protected areas as well. So it's a different approach, but this one's it's a little bit rougher of data, and we're trying to refine this again going forward. But you'd be able to look at particular sites of interest, the climate risk scores, different categories of assessment of how those sites are being ranked, and the number of species that were modeled. You could then look at the marine species, which is very similar to fisheries. And you could also have an analyze areas area. So that would be like where you're drawing a polygon on a map and you can extract data of what you actually want. So these ones are both undergoing refinement. And we have goals going forward. So I mentioned having higher resolution data. So we want to go to 5 by 5 kilometer resolution, which is underway. We want to continue this refinement with communities and fishers to make sure that it's not just going to be out of date every year. We're exploring this data being integrated with other areas. So we're talking to Global Fishing Watch and Blue Carbon Canada to see how they can work together. And then we want to finalize this prototype for Canada, ideally by next year, was what we're at for progress. And that's everything. So if you have questions, please let me know. Yes. Oh yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I had 2 quick questions. On the app you're creating to share the results, what will the scale of that be? I know this has been done globally. Will that be ultimately available globally?
So we're debating. The goal is to make it global. It takes a lot of. We're trying to figure out the balance between going global and also having a country refined data. So currently we're thinking of sticking to Canada for fisheries and MPAs, and then if we are working with Global Fishing Watch, for example, it's nice to have those underlying platforms that can help maintain global data. And so it would be really great. And as I'm working in like high seas world, it's nice to have that as well for when you're making these decisions. So it's just a matter of like long-term funding and if it's us that maintains it or another platform. But yes, we're definitely considering it.
And another quick question. You mentioned that the vulnerability was showing up as higher scores along the coast, like in the coastal band.
Yeah.
Is that purely driven by climate, or is that an interaction with other stressors like pollution, overfishing, development, those types of things?
Good question. From my knowledge, I was not on the original papers when it was done. From my knowledge, it's primarily driven by like climate impacts. So what they included is like temperature and like sea surface temperature and acidification, everything. I don't know the extent, honestly, to which they have runoff pollution in there as well. I know they have anthropogenic pressures, so it's just a matter of looking into what that entails. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting work, and I'm curious about the methods underlying kind of sensitivity and all the 3 buckets you have: adaptability, and we have had some climate vulnerability analysis in the Northeast, but it's really expert opinion driven. So I guess one question is this fully quantitative at all levels, and then secondarily, do you update this? Is this a static measure, or does this get updated, and are some of the metrics dynamic that inform this?
Yes, so for the first part, for quantitative, it is currently all quantitative. We're trying to figure out the best way to include subjective, like talking to people and including that. So we would ideally like to include a cultural importance avenue towards this. Again, it's then just figuring out the weight of quantitative and opinion-based and experience on the ground. So if you have suggestions, please talk to me. And then
I like that it was quantitative, actually.
Oh, okay, well then I'm glad, that's even better.
Well, I mean, it's easier to
I know.
the process is a little not that to discount that, but
Yeah.
I think that's been the struggle for us. How do you update? It's a long
I know, with
process
like,
to be the
knowledge.
fully expert
Yeah.
opinion version. So I think there's maybe value in both, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I know. Yeah, as it's hard when you work with communities, and so they want to also have their input. When you go to a certain area, everyone has their specific input they want to include. And so, I guess on the topic of refinement, that is also like these were created in 2021 originally, and so there is now talk in 2025 to include updated variables, and so they want to switch to different like sea surface temperature variables. So there is refinement. I think the goal would be to release the platform and then have refinement continue as more data comes out. Yeah.
I think we have an online question.
How can we stay in the loop on the progress and launch of the fisheries prototype / app?
Ooh, yeah. Great question. I would say, can you email me and then I will figure out the best way to do this, because like for the fisheries prototype, we're hoping to have like it kind of undergo a lot of discussion and refinement. And currently we have a Fisheries and Oceans Canada steering committee to help get this going for Canada. If you're interested, if you're from America or Canada, I mean, email me and then I'm happy to set something up. We have a website that is gonna be released just to kind of say that it's upcoming, and then we'll probably figure out a way to just send out updates through that website. So email me, and then when we get to that point, I will follow up with those interested.
Hi, this is really interesting. I
Yeah.
was curious, in the criteria, it seems like you would have a lot of knowledge gaps, and sort of how do you kind of rank sort of how much information you actually have to feed into this, or whether you're sort of going by like closely related species to kind of get at a good estimate? So I kind of how do you share, or how do you rate the quality
Like
of
this-
the information?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I was also curious if you're including species interactions like disease or invasive predators that might have range shifts, and
Yeah.
I know that's complex.
No, yeah,
to
it is
incorporate.
complex, and we've had that a lot come up. With regards to species interactions, because of the models that we are using already, and they are produced on a global scale, including interactions would, the models have currently broken computers, so having interactions on that would likely be a next level of this. So it's, at this point, I think it would probably not be incorporated for interactions, but just like considering the overlap of species compositions right now is kind of what we're going for. And for knowledge gaps, there is, so species when they're modeled, there's areas, of course, that have higher and lower confidence. With the distributions, the goal also with these prototypes is to show a map of uncertainty and where the knowledge gaps are, in the sense of some areas have less data. So when you're producing those models, there's less confidence in where the species are. And so the idea, at least when we're visualizing it, is to show the overlap of one area has these assessments of climate risk, but it might also overlap with an area of uncertainty. So when you're making decisions, you have to at least consider it. But going forward, I think we even talked about it in the plenary session, it's the best that we have. So in that sense, you kind of just go with what the data is showing for right now. Yeah, does that answer? Or if you have more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have one more minute with Amy if anyone else has a question. No, we can put more.
This is a great tool, but I was just wondering, so how are lobster faring in the future? How will they be?
Oh, how are lobster faring? Yeah, so another thing I guess I should mention is that this one is considering, so it considers future variables, but it maps them on a present day distribution. So presently they are at a moderate risk, and depending on which area, so there was a figure I showed of various fishing areas, it can differ between high and moderate risk, but primarily they're at a moderate risk. So it just means that lowering emissions basically is the best approach to help with the risk associated to them. But if you want to look at particular areas, you'd have to kind of look at the map, kind of. Yeah. Yeah. And I can show you that as well on my computer later.
And that is all the time we have. Thank you, Amy.